However, it comes just a day after those two big strikes yesterday. So, firstly, on the one in the Kursk region, the local governor has said that as a result of the drone strike in the area of the Kursk airfield, this is a direct quote, an oil storage tank caught fire. There were no casualties. Okay, fine. So we'll deal with that as the news comes out. Of course, remember yesterday, the initial news that came from Russian media channels was that there was a fuel truck that had caught fire and killed 3 people and injured some others. I mean, that turns out that was technically true, but the fuel truck caught fire as part of the explosion that smashed up the Tu-95 Bear long-range bomber next to it. So on to those strikes. Yesterday, we had two strikes deep inside Russia, thought to be now yet to be confirmed. Ukraine still haven't claimed responsibility. Nobody has claimed responsibility, but it's assessed to be an attack by Ukraine. And we think it was the Tupolev Tu-141 Strij drone, which translates very roughly, and not just my bad translation, but translates as Swift. Now, this is an old Soviet-era reconnaissance drone. I think they also used them for aerial targets for jets to go up against and what have you. I mean, first seen in the 1970s, really basic technology, and it shouldn't have got that far. It shouldn't have got hundreds of kilometers inside Russia, no matter where it came from. I mean, the air defenses should have seen it coming, should have done something about it. Just take your minds back to March the 10th of this year. Another Tupolev Tu-141 crashed in Zagreb, the capital of Croatia, having flown through Romanian and Hungarian airspace. Now, at the time, everyone thought that was a Russian drone. We still don't know. It might be Russian. Maybe it was Ukrainian testing whatever they used yesterday. If indeed they did, we don't know. I think probably it was Russian. However, it caused a lot of consternation at the time. It flew over Croatia and, like I say, Romania and Hungary, and although we are told it was picked up by NATO's air defences, it wasn't dealt with. It wasn't shot down. Now, it caused no injuries, but it just shows that air defense networks are not total. You can get through them. However, it is still a glaring error, I think, by Russia to have these long-range strategic bomber sites attacked in this way. And we think 2 Tu-95 Bears were damaged in the strikes yesterday, and possibly some others. There were at one of the sites. There's also it's the home for the Ilyushin big aircraft that they use for refueling. Just as important. I mean, if you don't get your refueling aircraft in the air, you don't get your bombers in the air, basically. So onto the strikes yesterday. So President Zelensky said that out of 70 missiles launched by Russia, most were shot down. They did result in power cuts across all regions of the country. They're extending into today. The Ukrainian Air Force have given a few more details, and we're going to get a bit technical here, but it's important to have what information we can. So the Ukrainian Air Force is saying that there were 38 KH-101 or KH-555 missiles. Now, these are air-launched cruise missiles, ranges up to about 3,000 kilometers, slightly different between those two variants, but long-range air-launched cruise missiles. And Ukrainian Air Force is saying that they came from 8 of these Tu-95 bombers, the Bear bombers. Ukrainian Air Force also saying that 22 Caliber cruise missiles that we think were either ship-launched or submarine-launched from the Black Sea fleet, with ranges into the hundreds of kilometers. They were also fired. 3 Kh-22 anti-ship missiles were fired by Tu-22 bombers. These are the long-range supersonic Tupolev bombers. Interesting there, that chimes with what we've seen recently of Russia using munitions in their secondary capacity, i.e. that's an anti-ship missile. It's being fired from the air towards the ground, and as I say many times, it will still go bang when it gets to the X, when it reaches its destination. So it's still very dangerous. But any missile, any munition that's used not in its primary role is never going to be as efficient. So the guidance technology on these things will not be as good if they're going air to ground as opposed to sort of against a ship. It's just the way they're built. And we think they're doing this because simply they are running out of other munitions. They're running out of precision-guided munitions. They're running their stocks down. They're having to, in effect, misuse what they've got left in the locker. And finally, there are a number of Su-35 fighters. These are the small jet fighters, but they fired a number of Kh-31 HARM missiles. So these are the high-speed anti-radiation missiles, air-to-ground anti-radiation missiles. These are designed to destroy ground-based air defenses. So you've got the Ukrainian air defense network with their radars looking up into the sky. They emit energy to come and bounce off any big metal object in the sky, be it a plane or a missile. And what the Su-35s are there to do is to fire missiles that home in on that radiated energy and destroy those radars. And that's the first thing that you would want to do ahead of any package that you're trying to squeeze through to then head on to their targets. So a bit wonkish, but that seems to be the detail. In total, about 70 missiles, of which most were shot down. Most, of course, some got through. I don't think it killed anybody. We think there were injuries and there was damage to infrastructure, but we don't think there were any deaths. Importantly, though, I think yesterday's quite an important day because it shows fairly small, cheap and cheerful, fairly old anti-air defences, such as the German Gepard system, which is a self-propelled gun, twin 35mm cannons that just blast a huge amount of lead into the sky to shoot down aircraft or helicopters or cruise missiles or anything. It's showing that these weapons are up to, if they're in their numbers, they are capable of defeating a very expensive air attack by Russia. And so when it comes down to the economics of war, I mean, you just can't keep, Russia will not be able to keep doing these strikes of 70 sort of air-launched cruise missiles and others at a time if most are being shot down. A few weeks ago, of course, when there was the clamour for Ukraine to be given these smaller systems, they were having to use very expensive missiles, with some missiles costing in the hundreds of thousands of dollars were having to be used against the Shahed 136, the Iranian drones that cost about $20,000. So again, the economics there just do not work. But Ukraine seems to be in a better place now and is using older, more simple kit against some of these cruise missiles. Of course, there's still a long way to go, and as ever in the military world, it's cat and mouse. So the opposition will come up with some way to defeat your systems, and you then have to get past that, and then they'll come up with a countermeasure, etc., etc. So it was by no means over, but I think Ukraine are in a much better place than they were just a few weeks ago. And I've been very critical of Germany in the past, but fair play to them for sending these Gepards, and I think they sent another 6, or agreed to send another 6 last week. So a quick blast there, no pun intended, on yesterday's air attack. There will be more, unfortunately, but I think the takeaway is that Ukraine managed to strike very, very deep inside Russia and defend itself from an air bombardment, which, for those scholars, it will have to happen in slow time. But I think yesterday will prove to be a very interesting day in terms of the evolution of military warfare. But that's a conversation for another time. One more little piece of news before I stop here. Remember last week we talked about Ukrainian embassies and diplomatic missions around the world being sent hate mail and letter bombs in the US. Well, more bloody packages have arrived, the foreign minister said today, in Romania and Denmark. This is after last week. There were a number of packages containing animal eyes sent to Ukrainian diplomatic missions. I mean, it seems it's a fairly low-level attack. In the letter bomb in the US, the security guard was injured in the hands and the face when the thing went off, but no life-changing injuries, we are told. So this is a fairly low-level attack, unlikely to be Russian state-sponsored, but it is, as with any of these things, you get some crazies who sort of jump on the bandwagon. You get the copycat attacks. No one's claiming responsibility for these latest attacks, but it's just one to watch there. And I'll take a little pause.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dom Nichols. Just a reminder to our listeners, Dom Nichols and John Spencer, our guests today, are sharing the same phone. So you'll see John speaking when sometimes it's Dom, but hopefully you'll be able to recognise the difference between their voices. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for joining us again. You've written a fascinating article for The Telegraph. The title is "The West Has Taken Its Eyes Off the Nuclear Ball." That's for our listeners if you want to go and read it. What did you mean by that? What do you think is happening?
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for having me on again. I think with the whole nuclear rhetoric at the moment, we were, Bob Seeley and I, who wrote it, Bob C, MP for the Isle of Wight, has studied Russia in great detail and actually lived in Ukraine. We're looking back at what has happened in the last 20 years, really since the end of the Cold War, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons has been quite stark. China has increased its holdings of nuclear warheads by 3 up to 1,500. Iran now appears to be nuclear capable. Certainly the Israelis are convinced about that. And also North Korea is, I don't think they're nuclear capable yet, but they have ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and probably warheads, but probably haven't yet fitted them together. And I think that's against the backdrop of what we're seeing in Ukraine. Putin is using the nuclear issue, I think, generally to keep NATO out of the direct fight in Ukraine, and that is working. Bob and I have also written a paper which sadly won't be published until January in the US, but that is very much looking at, because of the way that nuclear weapons are proliferated and the fact that we've taken our eye off the ball, is that making it more likely that Putin will use the nuclear option in Ukraine? And I'll just unpack that a little bit. I mean, but going to the end, I don't think he will. But there is one scenario which I'm very keen to get your views on, where he might. And if we look at the context, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a global treaty to prevent non-proliferation, hasn't met for many years, but did meet last summer. The START talks, the strategic arms limitation talks between the US and Russia, were supposed to be happening last week, but the Russians cancelled them at very short notice. Last week also, Putin said he was upgrading all his nuclear facilities in Russia, and only today, Lavrov has actually declared that it's the NATO that's saber-rattling. And when we look at the potential for nuclear, I think the strategic piece, the Armageddon piece over Ukraine, just won't happen. I think there are far too many checks and balances. The tactical nuclear weapons, euphemistically called the sort of smaller nuclear weapons, these are still massive, 10,000 tons equivalent of conventional explosive. I agree with a lot of other commentators that these weapons are probably unusable. Interesting to hear British intelligence last week saying that the Russians were taking tactical nuclear warheads off cruise missiles to use them conventionally, which in a way points to the fact that I'm sure the Brits and the American intelligence know exactly what's happening with Putin's tactical nuclear weapons. So, and also I understand that the state of these things, which haven't probably been tested for, 10 or 15 years, it's possible that they don't work anyway. The third scenario, which I think is the one that most concerns me, is the weaponization of nuclear power stations. We've discussed before the fact that Putin is directly attacking infrastructure, particularly the power grid, to break it down. There are still 2 active nuclear power stations in Ukraine producing power, and there is a concern that they may be targeted. But it's great to hear the air defense is working so well. But Zaporizhzhia itself is a different kettle of fish. When I was the Peshmerga's chemical weapons advisor in the fight with ISIS, some listeners may remember that back in 2017, ISIS blew up a place called Al-Mishraq, a massive sulfur mine and sulfur factory. This put a huge cloud of sulfur dioxide in the air, 400,000 tons across the advancing Iraqi troops who were heading towards Mosul, and delayed them for 2 or 3 weeks. And this brings me back to Zaporizhzhia, the most likely way that Putin could use nuclear material, because if he decided to attack there, the downwind hazard, as we call it, would go straight across, sort of due west, across the top of Kherson, and any direct approach into Crimea. And my sort of question and point for discussion is, looking at Crimea, is Crimea Putin's vital ground? And in military parlance, vital ground is ground that is lost would make your mission untenable, and you should use all means and all weapons necessary to hold it. Conversely, is Crimea Ukraine's vital ground, I would think that at the beginning of the war, pre 24th of February this year, maybe it wasn't Ukraine's vital ground. However, now, certainly with what is coming out of Kyiv, is that probably is. And would a move into Ukraine, would that make Putin approach it slightly differently and potentially lead to the use of either nuclear or, I think in my position, more likely, Zaporizhia. I'll just stop there. I would like to plug our application on Telegram, which teaches civilians how to prepare and survive any nuclear accident. But I'll come back to that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hamish. Well, we worked out before coming on air that today we have three former soldiers with probably, we think, over 70 years of experience between them in the British and American army. So let's take Hamish's question on Crimea and vital ground, and can I put it to Dom and John Spencer? What would your thinking on this be?
Well, David, thanks for having me, and Dom as well. Honored to be a part of the show. I'm a weekly listener. Zaporizhia is a wicked problem. It's not my area of expertise, but I agree with the international community. Just set up a demilitarized zone around it. Get it out of the equation. Russians aren't going to do that. That's the most likely scenario. I've liked that the UN inspectors have been there and remain there to keep information flowing on what's actually happening to avoid what I think Hamish is talking about, which is whether the Russians know they do it or not, some type of global incident because of the fact that they're using it as the base of operations.
Thanks, John. Dom Nichols, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think that is, at the moment, I think that's absolutely correct because Putin is pushing this strategy of attacking the energy. I don't think it's working at all. I think all the evidence there is that all it's doing is hardening Ukrainian resolve. And so I just wonder if and when Putin realizes that the idea of some kind of strike on Zaporizhia or any other nuclear power plants would actually not be would not be in line with the energy strategy and would be a massive escalation in terms of the radiological fallout from it, literal and figurative fallout. And so I just wonder if actually, whilst I accept it is vital ground today, I wonder for how much longer that is. I think the longer term vital ground for Ukraine is that support, that political support from externals. I don't want to just say the West, because there's many other countries outside of the West who support Ukraine, but it's such easy shorthand and it takes me longer to explain this. I might just stick with the West a bit, to be honest, from now on. So I just wonder if the efforts we see there, these conversations that we know Putin has with Chancellor Scholz and President Macron and others, I just wonder if he's going to then start moving into that front and sees that as the vital ground. But hey, that's another conversation for another day. But for right now, I think, for the foreseeable future, I agree that I think these nuclear power plants are the areas to watch, and it needs urgent world attention. Calling the UN.
Thank you very much, Dom. Hamish, do you want to add to that, or shall we move to John Spencer?
Well, just very quickly, I absolutely agree with John. The way ahead is a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, around Zaporizhia and the other nuclear power stations, probably run by the IEA, which is the UN's body on this, maybe needed to be supported elsewhere. But if the Russians were serious about not wanting to create a massive radiological problem, then hopefully they would go to that. I'm still not clear in my own mind about the Crimea itself, and perhaps that is an area that we need to look at and consider in future, whether if Ukraine did take that over in the next few weeks or months, that might seriously change the direction of this conflict.
Well, thank you very much, Hamish. Do stay for the rest of the talk. We're talking now to John Spencer, our guest today. I think actually this Hamish, what you've been saying leads into what we're going to be talking a bit with John about kind of perfectly. The reason Crimea is becoming vital ground for Ukraine is due to a huge part to the success of the Ukrainian armed forces. John Spencer, before Before we get into the details of this, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience, your background?
Sure. Thanks, David. So I'm John Spencer. I'm the chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Madison Policy Forum, host of the Urban Warfare Project podcast. I spent 25 years in the U.S. Army as an infantry soldier and officer. And then about a decade ago, I started focusing solely on urban warfare. Recently wrote a book called Understanding Urban Warfare, but I've been focused on researching, writing, training militaries, just studying solely combat in urban areas for a long time now, and have been very interested in taking, I'm sure we'll talk about it, a very direct role in the war in Ukraine, because it has been, and the lessons that should be there is that all roads lead to urban. In the Ukraine war, we know that this war started with the most important strategic objective was the Kyiv, the seat of political power. The Russians failed at that, and there's lots of reasons why they did, but the urban terrain is unavoidable, and that's what I study, that's what I teach, that's what I write about.
So let's talk a little bit about the Battle of Kyiv. You went to Ukraine in the summer to study it. What did you learn? I mean, you just mentioned that, as we know that the Russians failed in their objective to capture it. Why did they fail?
Well, that's a long list, really, of reasons, both in terrain. Every city is different. I went there to study, I think it is the most important battle of the modern era, a single decisive battle, as in it achieved Ukraine's strategic objectives of, at the time, surviving the Russian invasion. And it took away Russia's strategic objective, which was to basically do a regime change, put in their own proxy. I walked the ground in places like Bucha, Irpin, Mashun, Brovary to get an understanding of just how did the Ukrainians do it with really just a single mechanized brigade and a couple artillery units defend against the second most powerful military on paper. We've learned that that's not true anymore. Well, they did it with a mix of civilian support. They did it with a mix of understanding the terrain better, from even raising the water levels of the rivers, blocking all the roads, blowing all the bridges, arming 20,000 civilians on a single day with an AK-47 and 2 magazines, creating basically a castle, and closing the gates of the castle of Kyiv, which actually is very applicable to this ancient city that grew on the river. They closed the gates. They funneled the Russians, who had their own problems of being able to do joint warfare, but closed the gates, created death traps, took away the airfield that the Russians tried to use. And the Russians had multiple courses of actions on how they would achieve taking down Kyiv, but every one of them failed in a lot of part due to some genius actions by Ukraine and by the sheer will to fight of the Ukrainian soldiers, and really important, the Ukrainian civilians, which is very unique to this battle, was really the mobilization of the civilian population.
Well, there's so much to get into this. We'd like to talk a little bit about the mobilization of civilians later, but just still talking relatively broadly, I mean, did anything surprise you about what you learned about the Battle of Kyiv? Was there anything that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot. I mean, I learned so much, and I met so many amazing people that came out on day one to resist. I found the use of the infrastructure. So in my world, I often have to explain to people what is urban, although most people think they know that it's just a bunch of buildings. But by definition, urban means that there's a lot of buildings on top of natural terrain. There's a population, and then there's the infrastructure to support that population. That's the definition for us of urban. Well, in the Battle of Kyiv, uniquely, not the first one in history, but uniquely, it wasn't the actual fighting of buildings that came into play. It was how the Ukrainians used the population and the infrastructure to support their objective of defending terrain to buy time. That was the key. If you can stop the shock and all, the attacker wants to use speed, and they should. If you could slow them down just a little bit, buy time for other resources to become. And this is what we saw in the Battle of Kyiv, is that they ground the Russians to a halt, but that wasn't all that had to be done. Other forces had to be brought in. You had to trick the Russians who thought that it would be a short mission. I learned so much in all the different areas that I couldn't have gotten had I not walked the ground, and that's a real big part of my research. I went to Nagorno-Karabakh last year. I spent a lot of times because terrain matters. Despite what we talk about a lot in the science of warfare and all the technologies and the weapons, it often comes down to terrain, and terrain really matters in warfare. And really, the Battle of Kyiv is such a great example in so many ways. Even the battle, the skirmish, or the smaller Battle of Mashun, where the Russians had found a way to get past all the Kyiv units and defenders, and if they would have gotten through that unit in this village of Mashun on the outskirts of Kyiv, they might have been able to penetrate all the way into Kyiv. But this, single company force with some civilian defenders held off, using the terrain, again, using the fact that militaries really can't cross rivers very well, and it's a sometimes unpracticed drill to cross obstacles, whether it's a water obstacle or you park a bus in the middle of the road. It's going to be a big problem for militaries, and we saw all of this. So there is a long list of what I learned, but I was really surprised about the rivers, how the Ukrainians flooded some areas, but they also just raised the river, not just to Irpin, but two other rivers, to create even bigger obstacles for the Russians to, again, buy time, to target them, to break them apart. All these principles of urban warfare that have spanned history, but I couldn't find any other battle that I know of where the Ukrainians did it so quickly, of using their city as a weapon.
This is absolutely fascinating, John. Thank you so much. Just projecting forward, I'm curious to ask, obviously we're talking just now about the Battle of Kyiv, that opened the defence of the city, the successful defence of the city opened the invasion, really. Looking forward over the last few months and to today, how do you see both sides evolving their tactics? Do we think that the Russians have learnt much since their failed assault on the capital? And how have the Ukrainians changed their approach, or developed or changed their own tactics?
Yeah, that's a big one, and this is why I come to your space daily and weekly, is to learn, because this war has so many lessons for me, and not just because I'm the urban guy, but what battle we've been talking about, whether it's Bakhmut, Kherson, Lyman, the battles to come over Kramatorsk or Donetsk or Luhansk, they're urban areas. Urban areas have this problem of popping up on where you want to go. The road that you want to take, whether it's the major highway or not, is going to go through urbans. Yes, the Russians did learn from their mistakes, and once they changed their overall objective, they were able to focus in on a smaller objective and create a little bit of a gain. That's what we saw, when they focused on the Donbass. They started to actually use their own doctrine and using mass and artillery fire. But the Ukrainians also learned, and you showed the world that they can use their weapons more effectively. In another battle, which will go down, and I write case studies at the Modern War Institute, where I take a battle and I write a case study to try to summarize it. And everybody kept asking me in the Battle of Kherson is, when is it going to get to the house-to-house fighting? And how destructive is that going to be on the city? And look, every city is different. The Ukrainians learned and used their weapon systems to create the effect that they wanted, which is make the terrain untenable for the Russian forces who were occupying the city, and they had no choice but to withdraw or die. So they didn't need to go house to house, and that's kind of the problem with some mental frameworks on urban warfare. But the different battles, like the Battle of Mariupol, was night and day to the Battle of Kherson because of the different context and different variables of the terrain, the actual objective for the city. All these variables, I think, will come to play as we see what I think will be the Ukrainians continuing to advance in the offense, but taking each bit of terrain and going through all the mission variables and all the variables that we talk about in the military to do it in a better way, and to not play to your enemy's strengths. And I think that's what we've seen as well. The Russians, when they did learn from their mistakes of trying to do this massive countrywide 7 avenues of approach spread too thin, that okay, we can't do that, so let's do massing. Well, the Ukrainians didn't give them that. The Ukrainians are not going to mass and clash in the open terrain. They're picking them apart behind their lines, attacking the logistical lines, making it so it's untenable for the Russians to stay where they're at. Or in the case of Bakhmut, which is might not make the definition of urban at this point, based on civilian population and infrastructure left. But if the enemy wants to continue to smash against your defense, don't interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake, and keep letting the Russians die over Bakhmut, which has no real operational significance. But tactically, if that's where the Russians want to die, then the Ukrainians are giving them that.
Thanks, John. Can I just take you back? I realize in this podcast now, I'm the only one without any military experience compared to Hamish, Dom, and yourself. So I'm just going to ask a question for those of us who are not involved in the military. You said that the Ukrainians are going to be considering all of the variables, all the different sort of variables you consider in the military when you're planning an assault to take back land, take back cities. Could you walk the listeners through what those variables might be? What will they be looking at? What will they be balancing when they think of the coming advance?
Sure. I didn't know I would get tested, although knowing that Dom's here in some of the past episodes, I thought I might be ready. And I did teach strategy and tactics at West Point while I was there. So what I was talking about is usually what we refer to as the mission variables, right? The mission, like what is the actual objective of this operation? And the Ukrainians are doing just these amazing planning process, and we've seen videos of their rehearsals and their whiteboards or the terrain models. So the mission, the enemy situation, the terrain, and when you get to urban warfare, that has a lot of variables in just the terrain variable. The troops available, what formations do you have available? Do you have armor? Do you have a mix of everything from Humvees to MRAPs to Bushmasters? How much infantry do you have? The time available, because time is always a factor based on, and we've seen this in the operational level and at the tactical level, time versus terrain and the Ukrainians' ability to maneuver forces, whether it's reserves or just cover large amounts of terrain faster than the Russians, was a big part, I think, of the last, the Kharkiv offensive, was their mobility and ability. But these things we call mission of variables, so that we call it MET-TC. And of course, you have civilian considerations in there. Those are the kinds of things that every military before an operation goes through those variables and the impacts it will have on the mission. Each one of the variables will have an impact on you and have an impact on your enemy, and if it's urban terrain, have an impact on the civilian population. And there's all the planning, and this is the deliberate process which we are seeing the Ukrainians just get better and better at. I'm so impressed with what I see, not just in their morale and the way they carry themselves and their equipment and all of that, but the fact that they're going through this planning process and these mission variables, like we saw. I know that was a major consideration in the Battle of Kherson, was you analyzing the enemy, and each one of these variables, opens up the pages of sub variables, analyzing the enemy's strengths to determine what attacks and what fires, matrix, and things like that you're going to do in the operation. Hopefully that covers it without teaching a class.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you, John. And just a couple more questions from me before we'll bring in Hamish and Dom, who I'm sure have many questions as well. We've got a question from a listener just asking to hear a little bit more about Valery Zaluzhny. This is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And you've spoken a lot about what the Ukrainians are doing. Can you talk to us a little bit about their Commander-in-Chief?
Well, I know he's a new guy on the block. I mean, there's kind of a revolving door of Russian generals, which is not a good sign. Zaluzhny. Oh, I thought you were talking about the Russian general. Okay, sorry. Amazing. Actually, not that much in the public eye, which is interesting. But clearly, one of the heroes that will go down in his ability to have that all these principles of war, and I know we talked about these on the space before, the elements of operational art, the fact that you see him through on the battlefield, but he gets a lot of credit. His background is very unique as well, but to be able to lead a military through these phases of a war like this and to keep that unity of command, to manage the inflow of weapons and supply, and to do this is, I'm amazed, as much as I am amazed by President Zelensky, is that the relationship too between, which I did a lot of talking about, there's always a relationship between the generals and the political leaders. And there's all these war theories about, the general wants the politician to stay out of the way and just let me execute this war. You can see there's a relationship between Zelensky and Zelensky, that it is a actual back and forth relationship with input for the political objectives, with the best military advice. I am pro-Ukrainian to a fault because they are the good guys, but I'm thoroughly impressed as a student of the history of war and the great captains, as we call them, the generals that achieved their nation's political goals. He has been at the center of this and deserves a lot of credit.
Thank you so much, John. Just one more question from me. Can we talk a little bit about your handbook, your book, Understanding Urban Warfare? Because it's sort of, I think, as we can understand, as we can say, it sort of went viral over the past, over the course of this invasion, and has been used, as we understand, in the defense of Ukraine. Can you tell us a little bit about it, and how did that happen?
Sure. So what you're talking about is my mini manual for the urban defender. So the book Understanding Urban Warfare is a book I published recently.
Forgive me, yes.
No problem. You can buy the one on Amazon if you'd like. But the mini manual for the urban defender is just a very humbling project I've been involved with. On February 24th, when the Russians invaded, and I saw calls going out to the Ukrainian civilians, literally over the radio, which is saying resist, make Molotov cocktails and resist. So I started tweeting, here are the things that I would do based on a little bit of research and a little bit of experience in urban warfare. These are the things that civilians could do to help resist, setting up roadblocks, ensuring that they stay protected and utilize the urban terrain to their advantage. Well, those tweets became a manual, and I called it the mini manual for the urban defender. And I just released version 5, which actually I used a lot of the stuff I've learned when I went to Ukraine and studied what they had done that had worked, to then teach me about, like the use of the infrastructure, to add to the manual. Well, the manual's, now it's 100 pages long, includes everything from how to purify water to how to set up different types of obstacles, how to park buses in the road and use the terrain to achieve your objectives. It's also been translated now. Of course, it was translated in Ukrainian. By March, the Ukrainian government had put it out on their website for resistors. And then one of the publishers in Ukraine printed up to 100,000 copies, and it was distributed all across Ukraine. So very humbling. But then it was also translated because it is this manual for civilians to rapidly understand with simple diagrams, simple instructions, what they can do to help defend their cities, help their militaries. It is a very kind of for a civilian, but I also used to be a ranger instructor, so I put some stuff in there about how to do an ambush correctly, how to carry your weapon correctly. It's also now been translated into about 14, the number keeps increasing, different languages, because there is this ideal of total resistance or total defense, where your civilian population will assist the military in defending their terrain against really evil. So there's been a lot of people interested in it across the world, but it started very specifically to help Ukrainians defend their cities. And I was humbled to see, I just started receiving pictures from around Ukraine where people were using it to train territorial defenses, or even in the army. And it has almost gained its own momentum. But I just released a new version, version 5, which you can get, you can download in PDF at my website, johnspenceronline.com.
Just out of interest, just before, sorry, Dom, sorry, Hamish, I know you must have questions, but I'm really curious. So you say there's 5 versions now. What are the new things you've added to it then?
Sure, yeah. I did get a lot of requests what to add, and there's some restrictions, but some of the recent things I've added were like how to use small arms, machine guns, and other direct fire weapons against slow-moving drones or helicopters, which is old, like the Gepard. If you just put a lot of lead in front of the thing and let it run into it, it'll actually bring things down. I added some new stuff about weapons. I added actually law of war, because I think that's really important. And what Ukraine has done from the beginning is kept not only their just cause, but also the just execution of the way they're fighting, to keep their alliances and keep their hope alive. So I put stuff in there about the law of war. I added more medical, because a tourniquet can save lives on the battlefield, but I added more stuff about medical in there. And I really went back as I was, first version 1, 2, and 3 were very frantically pushing them out as the need was requiring. I even learned from the Ukrainians about different types of obstacles that I put more detail so that other Ukrainians in other cities could do rapidly, or I refined a lot of the information based on what I've learned from the Ukrainians themselves on my tours. And I had more time. So it's really a rewrite. Version 5 is really a rewrite from the earlier version, which was the book that had a part in Ukraine's defense.
Thank you so much for all of that, John. Thank you for answering all the questions there. Hamish and Dom, I'm sure you've got questions for John. I will let any of you come in when you like.
John, fascinating, absolutely fascinating stuff. Thank you so much. I mean, we are very lucky that we have a huge number of people inside Ukraine listening to this right now, and they will be downloading the podcast later, many of whom may not have been able to get access to the mini manual. What simple practical things could you say did you think the most important are to give them right now? And it might be weapons or medical or tank traps or what have you, but a couple of things they can do this afternoon right now. What would you suggest?
So, I mean, if you put a knife to my back, I mean, number one is understanding how to stay protected from aerial munitions to direct fire. The urban terrain is called the great equalizer for a reason. Is that if you're a defender, it's ripe with military already developed terrain, especially the underground. The underground has always been the refuge for